That's us. When you saw that video, one of the details you didn't get was the fact that the whole United States, as the continent was forming, pivoted where we live. So we are at the crunch point of a lot of events that happened up to 600 million years ago. So here's the story of how it formed. About 600 million years ago, as the continent was forming, it crunched just the way we saw India crunch into the continent of Asia. Same thing happened. If you were here at about 600 million years ago, you would see the tectonic mountains forming just the way the Himalayas formed now. But back then, 600 million years ago, this was a totally different world than the one which we see. For example, there are no evidence of much life on the planet at that time. So you find, for instance, here, very few discernible fossils that we have a record of if you're in the rocks here along this walkway. When you crossed the river and you saw that wall of rocks, there's very, very little evidence in those of anything that's alive. So this is the time long before the evolution of life on this planet. So consequently, what we're going to take a look at is this region where the continents or hinge is a lead-in to where these rocks come from. So imagine you have these mountains, 600, actually ending up around 500 million years ago. The tectonic mountains were formed, and the highlands of the Hudson were formed. Now, over time, they have worn down. And what makes up these rocks is what is the worn down elements that came from those mountains. They were as high as the Himalayas, but now, as you drive up the Taconic Parkway, you notice they're only the remnants, the remains. Much of that is what has eroded to form these rocks. Okay, let me take you to the next one. Now, you can see where we live, it's in that region that's all that complicated mess of rocks. Now, the thing up at the top is the Adirondacks, and that's ancient rock too, but it hasn't worn down as much as the rocks we have in the tectonics. So consequently, if you walk across this region, it spreads out as you go further south. When you get further south, by the time you get to Georgia, this stuff is very, very much wider. In fact, you can start walking on the Appalachian Trail down in Georgia and walk all your way up to Maine and still be on that same ridge of ancient rock that's now worn down to just a nub of what it once was. So consequently, we are at the crunch point where all those came together. So what happened is you have lots of breaks and bends and folds in the rocks. So you see here where those black lines with the little arrows on them is the direction in which those rocks were fractured. Now, when I was a first learning driver, I got the car that 5 or 6 other people in my family had learned on. And over the course of time, there were dings and bumps that each person put into that car. So by the time I got it, it was hard to tell which bump came first and how the bumps were. So we have that same problem here. These are so ancient, these rocks, that they've been moved and twisted and turned many, many times since they were formed 500 million years ago. So consequently, we need to take a few minutes to take a look at how these were formed. Okay? Uh-oh. Now, these cracks are called faults. Now, when placed under pressure, if you look at Dutchess County, just the next county over, if you look, there's a certain pattern that I want you to observe. You'll notice that if you just look at the drainage, it has a certain diagonal direction. That the drainage is generally from northeast to southwest. If you look at where those cracks are, those faults are as they cross the county, they're from northeast to southwest. Now, if you look at the slope, how the angles are, the slopes of the hills, you'll notice that the high points are generally in the southeast corner of the county, and that's, if you look at the way the elevations are, there's a certain diagonal nature to all of the area. And when you drive down the Route 22, for instance, you're riding along a region in a valley, along hills on both sides you can see from your car windows. And if you drive along the Hudson, that's really the lowest land, the lowest part. So there is this kind of diagonal nature to the rocks. Now it continues across this county as well. And as you go further north, this same kind of parallel nature to all of these rock layers. So if we look at the way rock layers form, they always lie flat at the beginning. When they form in water, most of these rocks are sedimentary, which means they formed underwater. They're formed in flat-lying layers. They're not formed at steep angles. Okay? But it doesn't take much to look right here and see that these rocks are layered rocks, but they're at steep angles. So there have been faults that have moved these rocks into these steep angles. Now, if it's a slow-acting fault or a slow-acting pressure that causes these faults, you could get them to bend. And as you drive down 9, you will see, or if you drive over 84, you will see these gentle bends in the rock layers. Some are up bends and some are down bends, depending on the forces at work in the rock. So you can form them as an anticline, which is one of these upfolds, or a downfold synclines. But that depends on the forces acting over a long period of time, slowly. And sometimes you don't get to see them all because when they erode, you may only see the tops of the folds or the bottoms. So if you've ever been through, let's say, Pennsylvania, down the Pennsylvania Turnpike, when you go across those, you're looking at a bunch of folded rocks. And as you go under the tunnels, you're tunneling through those folds. But anticlines and synclines here are not nearly as common. Now, right up the street here, this is a picture from the rock right up the street. You can see the layers are thinly bedded, but in layers. Now, normally, each layer is a period of a year or a couple of years where the rocks have formed without change. Now, depending on how big the grains are, it could be from sandstone to shale to a mudstone. Unfortunately, where we live, almost none of it is pure. There is no pure sandstone. There is no pure shale because it all got mixed together in various proportions. So we have sandy shale or shaly sandstone. Or we have it's complicated. It's not as simple as the textbook example of a pure sandstone or a pure shale. But these rocks formed in what must have been a relatively gentle water environment. It couldn't be a very stormy environment. There is one place in the whole region where there was a shoreline with a lot of wave action, and that's over in New Paltz. The Schwangum, that mountain range is really a shoreline. But that's a whole different story, and we're not going to go there today. But here you can see all of these layers were formed in a nice, gently flowing waterway. If you were going to go swimming in the ocean and you were standing on the mountains we now call the Taconic Mountains, and you wanted to go to the ocean, instead of going toward the east, you would be going toward the west, because all of these rocks extended to the west. In fact, when you go across the interstate to Buffalo, you're seeing these rock layers get thinner and thinner. By the time you get to Ithaca, they form a bunch of deep trenches that form the whole region in the central part of New York State. By the time you get to Buffalo, they're down to only an inch or two, as that now tapers off going underneath Michigan and beyond. But essentially that started here, and all of this stuff eroded to become part of the western, as it eroded and deposited toward the roots. So all of these rocks are a result of that kind of action. So there's a typical fault. But you can see how the rocks are dislocated, separated. Now, if you're a little bit observant, I hope by the time you walk away from here and you pass one of these on the road that becomes obvious to you, you'll say, that's a fault. And the fault is a result of the motion of the earth shifting back and forth. Okay? Now, there are two kinds. One kind of fault is the result of pulling apart. Up here at the top, it's called the normal fault. You can see the layers are pulled apart. And you see the foot wall, that's the guys walking on the foot wall side, and the other side's the head wall. You notice that the head wall is moved down with respect to the foot wall. So that's normal. That's the way that earth crust breaks and spreads apart. On the other hand, there's a reverse fault in which the rocks are pushed together. That's the reverse. That what happens is the head wall moves down with respect to the foot wall. Do you see the Z? There's a Z in the reverse fault. So when you're driving down the road and you see them displaced this way, you can tell which one has moved with respect to the others. So that both of them happen to be quite common where we live. Remember, these are among the most ancient rocks in the continental United States. So they've been shoved and pushed and moved around quite a bit over the last 500 million years. When you get to Colorado, they're almost 1 mile down underneath that's the very bottom of the Grand Canyon are the rocks from here. And that's why you find very little in the way of living things. Okay? So, here you can see it a much more clearly as the normal fault, you don't see a Z. But in the reverse fault, you see the layers match up to make a Z. Okay? So, if you look around, you'll see these all over. Even some along the road as you come around off onto the land from the bridge, the Hudson River Bridge, you'll see those. Now, if you're familiar with this region, and you've driven on Route 9 into Poughkeepsie South, there's a road that connects Route 9 with 376 along Spackenkill. So if you know that road, you're driving over faults. And we go up one side of the fault to get to Cedar Avenue, then you look downhill, the bottom of the fault, you go up to the next fault, and down as you go from. When you drive to the Galleria, where the light intersection is, there's a steep hill from Sheaf Road. That's a fault. And if you've ever been driven around the back of the Galleria and you look over the side, you see there's a downthrown side from that fault, and that you're on a very tall fault. If you're from Hyde Park and you drive past the Culinary Institute, you're going to go up a very steep hill. That's another fault, a very big fault. That's Teller Hill, I believe they call that. My old man told me when he had a Ford, he had his first Ford, you couldn't go up that hill with your car, you had to back up the hill. It was too steep. And the only gear you could use to get up the hill was the backing gear. So you turned the car around. But now they fixed it so the rest of us can drive up and down that hill without much trouble. But the whole county, the whole region, here on this side of the river, there's faults all over the place for you to find. And one of the biggest ones is the one up 199 as you see you going over to the next river valley. As you cross that, that's another very, very large fault. So faults are quite common here. Now here's the point. To make a long story short, somewhere in Connecticut, somewhere where you just cross the border of New York State and go into Connecticut, in the south corner of Dutchess County, somewhere there was a great shove, and it pushed the rock layers from that southeast toward the northwest. And what it did was it made the rocks fault and fold all the way across from there over across the Hudson River, across the Walkway. So what you notice, for instance, if you've ever been to Squance Pond, Squance Pond is the north end of Candlewood Lake. There are rocks there that have great big crystals in them that look like eyes looking out at you from the rock. In fact, it's called Augen. Nice. Augen is German for eyes. So it looks like eyes looking out at you from the rock because it was so compressed that it formed those crystals in the rock. But as you go from there across to Poughkeepsie, the rocks get softer and more gently in their folds and breaks. There's not, in fact, at Poughkeepsie, if you match up the rocks at Poughkeepsie with other rocks, you'll find they're in Connecticut. That there's a thrust fault that pushed the rocks from Connecticut into Dutchess County. So consequently, that's all along the river. As you drive up the Third-Way, you're going to see rock layers getting younger and younger as you go up north. By the time you get to Kingston, we are in the rocks that formed about 350 million years ago. By now, you got fossils. By now, you can find clamshells, you can find creatures that live with hard parts that make good fossils. By the time you get to Catskill, now you begin seeing fish in the rock layers. So if you're riding up this Route 9W, you're seeing the history of the Earth in the rock layers as you go further north. As you go further south, they get older and older. By the time you get to New Jersey, going down that road, they're the same age as. So that's really the story of the rock layers that make up our region. It's a story that's among the most ancient stories of the United States. There's hardly any place you can find rock layers that match. Here's an interesting aspect. Many of the names given to these rock layers are English names of places in England. Well, it turns out in that drifting continent picture I showed you in the beginning, Britain, the British Isles, was really attached in the early days, attached to what is now Maine and Nova Scotia. But in time, those pieces of the continent drifted to its present position just off the coast of the European continent. So many of the rocks there are identical to the rocks here because they were all formed at about the same time. They have the same fossils, and consequently, they're the same names because they're dated the same. And it just so happened that the British had a lead on us in the fact of naming the rock layers. So we inherited their naming system. But consequently, they all show this connection of how this was formed. Now, so there's Mohawk, and that's probably the other end. And you got to think about this, where we live here, as part of what's called the Hudson Estuary. We'll get to that. So, here, if you take a look at if you stacked all of the rocks of the Earth up, one on top of the other, so that we went from the very, very oldest at the bottom, about 400 million years. Now, I'm leaving out of this story the period of time from 4 billion years ago up to 500 million. That's a lot of time, okay? Most of the stuff is too boring even to bother you about, because it was just cooling, erosion, so there's nothing very interesting to tell. The real fun began around 600 million years ago. So anyhow, that's where the story begins, with those rocks way, way down there is where the tectonic was being built, the tectonic rocks. Okay, I can't get this thing to work on that but I can speak up on the bottom part where it says Precambrian. That's the top of the Precambrian. That's us. Okay. So there's really no hard parts. And as you go downriver, the rocks get older. As you go upriver, they get younger. So if you go pick up any of the rocks up there, you're likely to find all kinds of evidence of life. Okay, and this continues for a long, long way. Now there is one little fossil that we can find here. Across, I found them over by Marist. They're called graptolites. They're these, they look like little sawtooth in the rocks. Now those we can see today in what they're called man-o'-war. If you're a big aficionado of jellyfish, there is a variety of the jellyfish that has a little bit of calcium sticking out of it. It's relatively rare here, not so rare in Australia right now, but it gives us a pretty good clue of what the place was like. For a long period, those rocks were forming. If you go off the coast of Australia, you'll find the Coral Sea. And in that Coral Sea, it's a very quiet environment, and there are in them, commonly, there are these jellyfish that have spicules, they're called little strands of calcium that come off them, and they're preservable. Steve, you can't preserve jellyfish, but you can preserve these, and there's many of them here in the Hudson Valley. And they're a dead giveaway, but this is pretty ancient stuff. Okay. Now, let's switch to talk about the other chapter of the story. You know where you're sitting right now, a mere 10,000 years ago. Now remember, I want to impress you with the fact that 10,000 years is a blink of the eye compared with 600 million years. So we can really think of 10,000 years as yesterday, that it wasn't very long ago. But why you were here, if you were here a mere 10,000 years ago, you'd be buried under a mile-deep block of ice. You look at the great icy glacier, it contained a great deal of ice. In fact, it lowered the ocean. The ocean front, that is the shoreline, extended much further out to sea than it does today. It's kind of the opposite of global warming. So you're going to take all that water and put it into making ice. And that ice covered the whole North American continent down to the line which they're marked as the terminal moraine, the end of that glacier. So a large amount of ice is involved here. Now, today, you can see this going on in various parts of the planet, so we know what glaciers are like and how they behave, because, as I said, the present is the key to the past. What's going on now under those glaciers is very much like what went on 10,000 years ago when the glacier was here. So, you commonly find that glaciers will form these wide valleys. Generally, glaciers take narrow valleys and broaden them out to make these into U's. So when you drive around southern parts of the United States, many of the rivers are in these V-shaped valleys. They have never had any glaciers. But where you drive, where there have been glaciers, the valleys have these broad V shapes. So one big giveaway is the fact that the glacier acts like a piece of sandpaper. And it's driving as it pushes the ice down. Anytime snow gets to at least 100 feet, then the bottom becomes like a plastic material, plastic ice. It moves. And frequently, many glaciers move up to, maybe a half an inch a day. So that if they do, they're moving material along, frozen in the bottom of the ice, which acts like a kind of sandpaper, rubbing rocks against rocks with a profound weight, so it grinds them into a pulverizes them into a powder. And so you find, for instance, that when a glacier is passed, it produces a lot of loose clay-type material. And if you live here, one of the industries that made this region was brick making. Brick making was a very common occupation here. And it was great because immigrants were coming here, and you don't need a lot of brains to make bricks. Bricks are easy to make simply from using the mud that's common in anywhere and forming in blocks, drying and heating them. You make bricks. That's what made New York City great, was bricks that came from here. But that's another story. Anyhow, let's take the next step. I get there. There, if you see in an outline, is the edge of the glacier as it drove its way into the continent. Now, remember, when all of this stuff melts, it's going to carry some of that loose material with it. Now, out here, can't see what this thing is. In the Midwest, there are hundreds of feet of soil. Why? Because the glacier drained that land onto the continental center of the continent. And as you drive across Iowa, as you drive across Kansas, you're driving across that glacial remain. That's what makes it so good at growing wheat. You know, wheat goes into the ground about 3 times as far as the stuff you see on the surface. And it draws water from very deep in the soil. So it made our biggest export for many centuries, many years, has been our wheat. And because we're excellent at producing corn and wheat, of course, corn is everything you drive on, to what's in your syrup or what's in your candy bar. It's a very important part of our lives. But it was a result, it was a gift of the glacier. But when it comes to our region, as you drive along the Hudson, as you drive anywhere around here, you will see very few sharp-pointed cliffs. Why? Because the glacier, as it passed, rounded everything. We have lots of cirques. They're like places for concerts because it's rounded out all of these places by plucking off the rocks and attempted rounding. Now, also, you see up where it says the head wall. During the day, it might thaw a bit in the sunlight. Water gets in between the cracks of the rock. Then at night, when it cools down, those cracks freeze. When it does, it splits the rocks. Freezing expands water. So what happens, if you've ever been camping in California in high altitudes, sometimes in the middle of the night you'll hear a cracking. And And what's happening is the ice is getting in between the rocks. Well, you know what it does to roads here. So think about covering hundreds, thousands of miles each time, thawing and freezing and thawing and freezing. Cracks the rocks, they fall into the ice, and then it acts like a great big piece of sandpaper rolling its way down the valley, carving out the valley, making it deeper, making it broader and deeper and more U-shaped, which is characteristic of here up along the Hudson River. So, as it does, you're looking at a giant operation to cleave off and smooth off the ground. Now, what happens is the ice melts back. And when it does, sea level rises. So what happens is the sea invades where the ice was. We have that here. We have a situation here where the ice has melted back and the sea has invaded onto the river, what we call the river, which now means that part of that water out there is salt water from the sea, and part of it has tides. So if you have a place where you have seawater and tides mixing with fresh water, that's called So as the ice melted away, the shoreline retreats. Now it's called an estuary. So this technically is not a river. It's an estuary. An estuary is an arm of the sea. Salt water, fresh water. It's common over many, many places on the planet. The only thing that's uncommon is that it is a glacially carved estuary. And by definition, a glacially carved estuary is a fjord. So technically, if you want to impress your friends, this is a fjord. What you're looking at is a glacially carved estuary. That makes it a fjord. Now, it's different than the ones that you will see when you go to Norway, Sweden, New Zealand has them. Here's the difference. This fjord was carved while the sea was very much further out than it currently is. So what happens is there's a canyon that runs down the Hudson out into the sea. If you go to Sweden, it runs down the mountain and sharp into the sea. So that's the only difference. But what it has done for us is it made one of the world's best harbors. New York City, for most of its history, until recent years when it's getting silted up, but for most of its history, this was a great shipping port. In fact, one of the things that really ticked off the Southerners was most of the cotton that was produced in the South was being shipped from New York. And they didn't like the fact that New Yorkers were skimming off the top of their money, no matter how they raised it. Anyhow, that's another story. But the consequence is that this is different than many of the... If you want to find the delta, most rivers have a delta. The most famous, of course, is the Nile Delta, at that place where it meets the sea. Well, where is the Hudson's Delta? Well, it's further north. It's further north around the city of Hudson. There's a bunch of distributaries where the river breaks out into little pieces. How am I doing on time?
Keep going.
All right, I'm good. I got time to tell you a little story. Okay, I got a little story. The fact that this is salt water to become fresh water. The reason this bridge is so stinking high, 200 feet above the water, the reason it's so high, the Navy insisted on it. They wouldn't allow a bridge to be made lower. Why? Because in those days, it had wooden ships. And wooden ships had masts. And the masts the ships had to be able to clear of the bridge to get from salt water into fresh water. Now why? Because with wooden ships, you get barnacles. Barnacles stick on the sides of the ships. So what ships would commonly do was go from salt water into fresh water. Now the beauty of that is, here on the Hudson, the delta is up around Kingston. So who took advantage of this were whaling ships. Whaling ships have to be agile. They have to be able, in order to catch up with whales, they had to be able to turn quickly and be very agile in their navigation. But when you put a lot of barnacles on them, after being at sea for 3 years, they got pretty hard to manage. So what whaling ships would do was sail up the Hudson. Their masts could easily clear this bridge, and they would go up to Kingston, north of that to Hudson, and then go into one of these distributaries and push the boat over on its side. Take a team out and scrape down the sides, flip it to the other side, do the other. It's about a 2-week job. Now that meant 2 weeks sailors were for the most part at bay. They did nothing. So when sailors get a chance to do nothing, there are 2 things they are interested in. Well, Hudson, New York, was famous for its brothels. It had more brothels than any other part in the state. In fact, even today, you can walk underground in that town from building to building, so you wouldn't be seen going from building to building in Hudson. In Poughkeepsie, our benefit was we had beer. The guys that brewed the beer were the name Vassar. It was the Vassar Brothers Brewery that sat on Main Street here that produced all that beer that went back out to sea and also was consumed by sailors on leave. Now they were good men, the Vassar Brothers, and they didn't want to do something with this money that was not in good conscience. So they argued over whether they should build a hospital or build a school. So they made enough money to do both. The college is essentially the result of the beer industry. In fact, the Vassar teams call themselves the Brewers. And the hospital you can see now under construction, and with the guidance of Marist College, will become one of the best places for training doctors, as you see this concern. So we still benefit from the fact that this estuary was the one place that you could get barnacles off your boat. And so consequently, we all profit these days from this knowledge. But there's another problem. Okay, I wanted to show you this now. Hold on. This is a video that you have to start It's a video that shows this water going upstream. The ice you can see is floating upstream. There's a version of this online. I will give you the address at the end if you want it, where you can see it. But the next video, is the water going downstream. In fact, we call this the Hudson River because, you know, Hudson was interested in money. The Indians didn't have money. So the Indians called this the waters that go both ways. Now, if you've ever been out there in a boat, you know sometimes the tide's going in and sometimes it's going out because it's an estuary. So consequently, the river flows both ways, which incidentally is important to know that when you throw trash into the river, it doesn't go away. It just slushes back and forth. It's like the inside of your washing machine. For the most part, there's a downward flow. But when you put stuff in the river, it's not going to be somebody else's problem. It's going to be your problem. So the Hudson, being an estuary like this, has this particular thing. However, we have two very important factors that impacted our region. You go down this river, you'll notice as it begins to get into the remnants of the tectonics and the higher elevations, it's like a blockage. So melting ice water has to get through this tight boundary which it set between Storm King Mountain, which is on this side of the river, and Breakneck Ridge, which is on the other side of the river. It was a blockage that prevented that water from easily going south and out to sea. So what happened is that water backed up and produced a huge lake that extended across this whole region all the way up to Albany. As time went on, it drained away, but it had a great impact on the land. People who live in these valleys where this lake accumulated sediments may find very interesting things like their well is only 150 feet down, where their neighbor's well is 220 feet down. Why? Because underneath your land, there are lenses of clay that made up the bottom of those lakes. It also played havoc with the drainage. So a lot of people get water in their basements because there's so much of this clay that's part of this lake bottom that made up much of the Hudson Valley's lower regions. So it took a long time for the water to drain from this lake out through those blockage of the Storm King Mountain. So if you go down Route 9D, and you'll see the tunnel just before you get to the tunnel, the other side's called the Storm King. And this side is called Breakneck. They both have trails if you want, if you have the energy to do the climb. You can get a terrific view from the top of those. Has anybody done that? Yeah, so you know what I'm talking about. Especially during Leaf Keeper Week, it's practically a religious experience. It's such a beautiful sight in this country. And incidentally, there's no place else you can go to get a view like that. There's no place on this planet that has just that combination of the trees, the combination that produces colors, that you will never find anywhere else like that, anywhere. But consequently, though, this has played a very, very important part. It's one of the things, you can't make a city like New York without being able to provide it with materials to build. And much of the materials that comes to New York City in its building came from this valley. That it was a near and easy access to make, for instance, bricks, to crush into rocks that make the base of the Statue of Liberty, to make the base of the Empire State Building. You can't put a big building up like that without anchoring it securely to the earth. And you need lots of these materials to do that. And that all came from here. Another thing that happened, let me go one more. Okay, there's a view from above, and you can see, it's too bad I can't use my laser pointer, but you can see a boundary line just above where it says Wappingers Hopewell Junction, a line where that you can actually see a lake shoreline. If you ever go to the shore, it's always sandy and mixed sandy and rock. Well, over the years, because that stuff is very valuable, gravel, for instance, has been sold out. It's been used to make roads. Much of the interstate comes from, if you've ever been down the Jersey shore, there's these huge rocks that make jetties. They're jetties because the waves that come into New Jersey come at an angle. They don't come straight onto the beach. They come at an angle. And that means it moves the sand. Each wave coming on will move the sand. So you put up these jetties to stop the sand from migrating. And that was, all those rocks come from right here in the Hudson Valley. So this is a very important part of this. So you see in the condition where you have the topography builds, the melting water builds a lake. And that lake has the characteristics of other lakes, has its own little delta, has its own little islands, and that's all very common. As you drive around this region, you will find many of these hills. They're perfect to build developments because there's no rocks. It's just loose material, and you can easily put basements in. You can easily, the drainage is good enough, and it makes for a very easy construction. Now, trying this in Maine is a completely different story because there the soil is much, much thinner than it is here. Plus, because of that glacier, let me give you another example. The earliest industries here were farming. The earliest industries here, we had very early, in the early 1700s, this was a region that grew many of the crops that went to New York City to feed the big population. This is before New Jersey opened up for development as farmland. Well, here you have a lot of rocks in the fields left by the glacier. So one of the things you did was you had your children help you take the rocks out of the field, put them along the side of the field. And so all over Dutchess County, all over this county, you will find rock walls that don't appear to go anywhere. And what they are is a result of people clearing their fields of rocks so they could plow without destroying their plow. Now, one thing about rocks in a field, every winter when the water goes into the ground, it collects under the rock, freezes, and pushes the rock up. So you didn't do it once, you did it year after year after year. And you needed your kids to help you get those rocks out of the wood. That's how summer became. The original idea of the summer vacation was to help their parents rid their fields of a bunch of the things that interrupted their planting. So it's got, a much broader impact than just being a land covered by ice. Now, there's also a typical kind of hill which is very easy to identify in Hudson River, the Hudson River area. In fact, as you walk across this bridge, straight ahead is a park in the city of Poughkeepsie called, thank you, College Hill. College Hill, if you look at its shape, is this same shape. This is called the drumlin. As you drive around New York, you will find these shaped hills that are the result of the glacier moving over. Somewhere inside the body of that dome shape is a big rock, or a big rock layer that proved itself to be a little piece of resistance as the ice moved across the land. So consequently, it shaped these drumlins. And you will find them all over the Hudson Valley. But so this is a very common occurrence in our community, is the formation of these drumlins. They're excellent for putting communities like housing developments, or as you ride around them, you're riding over drumlins because they're easy for some guy with a few bucks to build a development that has excellent drainage and offers very little resistance to building, and it's easy to put roads on, and they're not insurmountable. So drumlins are very common, and they're also very useful. Now, you don't find this everywhere. You only find it in places that are evidence of glaciers. Now, if you fly over them, frequently you see them, they look like little herds of sheep because they're all little humped features that cover the ground. And if you're flying high enough, you see them, and they're called roche moutonnées, rock sheep from French. So it's a very common occurrence. But it also has a much stronger, how am I doing on time here? Okay, there's a much stronger influence. Let me make one other point about what you're looking at when you see it. Just down the street, across the river from West Point, is a foundry. It's called West Point Foundry. As you're traveling around the Hudson Valley, you owe yourself a chance to go visit West Point. But the West Point Foundry was a result of the fact that in the War of 1812, the British ships could outfire the American ships easily. Their cannons were better. So President Monroe says, we need a better place to build cannons that can fire against what the British had. So it just so happened there was a gentleman who had enough brains to think about putting it together, a foundry, without using government funds, without using money provided by the government. He founded the West Point Foundry, and they started building cannons. But this is the same time that steam engines were beginning to make their influence known, and so he switched from cannons to steam boilers, to pistons, to make all of the machinery that makes for machine tools, tools that could make bigger machines. And that was the West Point Foundry. And how they did it was they raised money through the sale of stocks and bonds. And where do you think they did that? Just at the end of the Hudson River in New York City. It's one of the reasons that made New York the financial capital of the world. Because we had entrepreneurs that saw the value of putting their money into something like the production of engines, production of cannons. In fact, the cannons that they produced here at the West Point Foundry were the first cannons to have rifling. The barrels had the ability to spin the cannonballs spinning, which kept them from tumbling and losing their direction. You could make them more accurate. So there was a design of a gun called the Parrott gun, named after a guy named Parrott, who produced a weapon that was made of iron, not steel, iron. And it could outfire most of the other guns and was very accurate. It was the gun we used in the Civil War at the top of in Gettysburg to practically disseminate any troops coming up that hill. The Parrott gun was one of the major reasons why we did so well in the Civil War. And it was the Parrott gun and the other parts that come from the West Point Foundry that worked with the West Point, with New York City's interest in finances to make that work. That also led to the fact that you could connect this Hudson River with the Great Lakes by building a canal. So one of the efforts that came out of that was DeWitt Clinton, who had the vision to say, we can put a canal so you can get from New York City west. There was only two places you could do that. One, up the Hudson through the Erie Canal. The other was south of Virginia. The rest of the places, it was too hard to cross those mountains. So what you did was you got immigrants to come up the Hudson, go over the canal, pick up a wagon at Conestoga, New York, and head yourself west to get yourself into the central. It would not have happened had it not been for the canal, the river. One other point. As that West Point Foundry in the southern part of this river ran short of iron, and the other part of the process of making iron is coal. Hard coal, anthracite coal. The best source of anthracite is in Pennsylvania. Well, how do you get the coal from Pennsylvania to that foundry? You're looking at it. This bridge, one of the motivations was for building this bridge was that it could be an easy way of transporting fuel for the foundries that lined the whole eastern seaboard. And this bridge served as the way to get this coal to its place of use. Now, what happened as we developed a bigger country and saw the immense amount of coal and iron in Lake Superior and coal in Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh was the natural place to put the big foundries. And it really, by then, the Industrial Revolution had started, and it started in Poughkeepsie. So consequently, this area played a very important part in American history. In fact, we're only just beginning to understand how important that was. We constantly were thinking of the future, IBM, let's have bigger industry. But we forgot that we here in the Hudson Valley had an unimpeachable history of being a very important part of the American culture. That it's hard to think of too many events that went on in this country without thinking of a certain amount of its roots here in the Hudson. We have the largest number of vice presidents of the United States. We have 4 right here in our estuary. Up the street in Rhinecliff was a vice president of the United States who built his place along with the other major estates here on the Hudson River. So we have a lot of history. We're just beginning to know what that history is because we've been so busy doing other things. We're beginning to get access to our river. Now, Scenic Hudson is doing an incredible job of making this Rand Bridge to us. Well, I want to thank you for coming today. This has been a really good opportunity to find out more about the Hudson. If there's anybody who wants me to answer specific questions,